My true crime segment today takes us back to the murder of Florence Horton on Rundle Street, Adelaide, in 1904. And there are reports the ghost of Florence haunts the Adelaide Arcade at the Rundle Mall entrance. Alan Tiller's a good man to speak to about this. He's an historian, a genealogist, author and paranormal investigator. He also knows Florence's story very well. Hi, Alan.
Hello.
How did Florence Horton die?
So on Saturday the 27th of February 1904, Florence went into Adelaide with two of her friends and she visited Central Markets. She walked up Rundle Street, and as she was heading back down Rundle Street, she was just across from the Adelaide Arcade, and her husband come up behind her. Now, they'd been estranged for a couple of weeks. They'd broken up and they'd moved out of their houses. He came up behind her and said to her, "I have a present for you. Would you please follow me into Arcade Lane," which is between Adelaide Arcade and Regent Arcade. She refused. He then tried to convince her two friends to tell her to follow him down the lane. And Florence said, "No, I'm not going to do that because the only present you have for me is a bullet." She turned away from her husband and he pulled out a revolver and shot her 3 times in the back.
Gosh. They had a fairly violent relationship for quite some time, Alan?
Yes. Thomas actually had a wife prior to Florence, and she died only 3 months before they got married. Before Florence and Thomas got married. So there's a bit of suspicion around what happened to his prior wife. When he got with Florence, he was known to be very brutal to her. He would lock her in the house at night and apparently beat her until they fell asleep. It wasn't the best of relationships.
What happened to Thomas? He was found guilty?
Yes, he was found guilty, and he was hung in the Adelaide jail about 3 or 4 months later.
When did stories start emerging of Florence's ghost?
Believe it or not, almost right away. She actually was shot in the middle of Rundle Street and she walked over to the footpath and died under the awning of the Adelaide Arcade. And she was taken inside to Solomon's Tobacco Store, which today is a coffee shop. And within 3 or 4 days, people started seeing an image of a woman wearing a large Edwardian gown that was sometimes blue, sometimes black, depending on the person's description. And that was within 3 or 4 days of her passing away. Since then, right up until very, very recently, people have seen her image not just on the lower level, but also on the upper level, around where 2-Bit Villains Cafe is today. She's described as around 5'7", 5'8". It's a very big flowing Edwardian dress with I guess you'd call it a pinafore, a white pinafore around her neck. And yeah, she's seen quite often, believe it or not.
You're listening to Alan Tiller. He is a historian, genealogist, author, paranormal investigator, telling us the story of Florence Horton, who was murdered back in 1904 by her estranged husband. Have you investigated whether or not there is a presence in the Adelaide Arcade, Alan?
I actually was part of a television show called Haunting Australia, and we investigated in 2013. We investigated the entire arcade. We were the first paranormal investigation team to do so. That show went around the world, a global show. We didn't actually encounter Florence. We encountered a different spirit, and Florence isn't as well known as some of the other spirits in the arcade, that one being a gentleman called Francis Clooney. He actually died at the opposite end of the arcade. We actually went into, believe it or not, there's basements under the Rundle Mall end, a lot of basements, not just the old basement that you see in the middle now with the piece of glass over the top. And we went down in there and we tried all different kinds of things. We had all different paranormal investigation equipment going, but we couldn't get her to communicate with us whatsoever. I do know of a psychic who used to have a shop up on the inside upper level, and she said that she used to see Florence quite often. And she always walked around, she always looked very morose, very sad.
Do people also, what are some of the other stories? Have people felt her?
I've been told stories of people saying that they've felt like a feminine energy has surrounded them, and then they've felt their face being stroked and their hair being stroked.
Is that happening to both men and women?
Men and women. Haven't happened to me, but I've had witnesses come forward while I was doing a Haunted Buildings in Adelaide project for the Adelaide City Council in 2016. Had a number of people come forward and describe this sensation of a feminine hand, feminine energy touching their face and touching their hair.
When Florence was killed in 1904, Alan, was this a big shock to Adelaide? You know, someone was shot in pretty much what was then and what is still the centre of the city.
Huge story. It went worldwide. Lots of media coverage. If people care to get on to the National Library of Australia's Trove, which allows you to research old newspapers, and just type in Florence Horton 1904, they'll find hundreds of stories from newspapers right around Australia. The coverage was phenomenal. Mind you, back then there was no television, no radio, so newspapers was it. So something like this became a huge story. And when Florence was actually buried on the 1st of March, 2,000 people showed up to her grave at West Terrace Cemetery to try and see the coffin being buried.
Oh, wow. Okay, so people felt bad about this having had happened. Somebody on my text line, Alan, is asking me to ask you, why do ghosts have clothes, as clothes are objects, not beings?
Good question. A question I don't have an answer for.
Right.
It's a worldwide phenomenon that I can't think of any spirits that have ever been seen naked, which to me is very unusual. Same thing is, why do ghosts not have tattoos? If people get tattoos and die, I would expect that those tattoos would be on the spirit, but so far I've not been made aware of any that have their tattoos either. So,
well, that is interesting. Alan, are you going to have another, investigation into Florence? See what else you can find at the Adelaide Arcade?
I do visit there from time to time. I have investigated at the Manhattan Dry Cleaners, which is the epicentre of a different haunting there. But Florence has been seen down that end as well. But so far I haven't been able to make any contact with her. Whether or not, it might be that she's not comfortable with me and she might be comfortable with someone around her own age or with a female, that might be the problem. But, she seems to be more of a quiet spirit, I guess you'd call it, benign. She doesn't really come forward unless she kind of feels she has to.
Fascinating stuff. Alan Tiller, thank you.
Thank you.
Historian, genealogist, author and paranormal investigator Alan Tiller. You're on ABC Radio Adelaide, South Australia and Broken Hill with me, Narelle Graham.